Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time today. We're not going to do a lot of slides. There's going to be one slide up. It's going to be more of a conversation. We're going to focus today on sort of three parts of a story. The first part's going to be a little bit about why do you stand up sort of cloud infrastructures and how does that help you sort of expose your data in ways that you can use it in new and exciting ways, especially with AI. The second piece will be, what does that look like for EHR data specifically, and what can you do with that EHR data, and what do we see? And the third piece is, how does a tool like Salesforce come into the mix in terms of activating that data in a variety of different ways? You'll see that my name is only listed, but I've got a colleague here, Ford, who's joining me as well. Just really brief background on myself. I'm a partner at PwC. I lead our capabilities around providers and Salesforce and what we do with those organizations. And there's a lot of collaboration and coordination with the various cloud applications in terms of finding ways to take that data and really activate it in unique ways within providers to drive engagement, drive better outcomes, drive increased insights, and we're going to talk through a little bit today. Before doing so, I'm going to let Ford introduce himself and talk a little bit about standing up some of those cloud platforms.
Hey, perfect. Thanks, Matt. Ford Culver, I'm also here a director in PwC's cloud and digital practice. A lot of the work that I focus on is working with healthcare providers, think through how do we go from on-prem data centers and start thinking through building use cases in the cloud and often migrating to AWS, starting to think through what services we need to help enable all those different use cases as well for our healthcare provider clients. So a couple things that we think through when we do these rebuilds and infrastructure type projects is we're often thinking through what's the landscape that our healthcare provider clients have. Do they have Epic? Do they have Salesforce? Are they using certain modules only? Do they have ServiceNow? And then we start understanding, what's that inventory, what's that catalog of applications that they have, and we often finding that many of those are sitting in data centers. Maybe they have some SaaS applications. We're finding just disparate technology and different sources, scattered throughout the organization. So then we start thinking through, well, what actually goes into picking AWS, as a cloud vendor, what services, and that's where we're starting to think through, okay, well, we have to have security at the forefront of everything we do. So we need to build, maybe a high trust framework. We need to get that data into a centralized location so we can really enable use cases. One of the key themes I heard yesterday from Andy, talk about is, data's the new currency. I think we've heard that expression for many years. And we really are, a lot of organizations, on the initial parts of their journey, they're going from typically data sets scattered in multiple silos, and maybe it's been enriched, maybe it's just raw in some places. And we think through, how do we really build a single source of truth to the extent we can in one place, and how do we secure it? How do we build that AD or that identity around all the data sets so we can really think through, how do we unlock the data? How do we start thinking through those high value use cases we can deploy? And it all starts with our foundational layer. It all starts with that first layer of the infrastructure getting deployed. And then I think from there, after we go through, understanding the cost, understanding the technology, understanding the services needed, understanding how we're going to build out this robust infrastructure, that's where we then start thinking, okay, what's going to sit on top of that data layer? Are we going to have Salesforce? How do we integrate maybe back into Epic, maybe into Cerner, whatever EMRs our provider clients are using? And do we need some tangential applications too, such as a visualization tool? Maybe we need to deploy SageMaker to have Gen AI, really be at the forefront of everything that we do. Which is really the trend we're seeing in the provider landscape.
Yep.
But on that note, I'm going to actually hand it off to Matt to kind of talk through how we're seeing Salesforce sit on top of this.
So what Ford sort of walked through there is, the first step is understanding what data do you have, where did that data sit, and what are the advantages of moving to cloud. You see some of them on the bottom, in terms of bringing, Epic, as an example, onto AWS, right? We talk about decreased costs. a lot of those decreased costs come from sort of the maintenance and the capital expenditure side of the house, right? You have the improved availability, right, in terms of the various tools that AWS allows in terms of making sure that you have, zone specific to you, right, all those things. Infrastructure upgrades, right, as you look at, as things continuously evolving, especially with the speed at which AI is evolving, right, how do you keep up with that in a way that allows you to focus on your core business versus focusing on, doing upgrades of your infrastructure day to day. Compliance obviously is a huge thing from a healthcare perspective, right? Not just because of the integrity of the data itself, but what you're doing with the data and how you're interacting with the data when it comes to the patients themselves. And then we do see, while the healthcare space has gotten better at interoperability, there still are many, many vendors where this data is locked within a black box. They don't have APIs that allow you to access it. And so if you start to enable a strategy where you're extracting that data into an environment like AWS, right, you have that flexibility now to say, okay, now that I have this, what do I do with it? And so once you establish that framework, what we're seeing, and we're going to use the example today of Salesforce, right, is if you've established that cloud infrastructure where that data sits there, think about different types of data that we typically see providers focused on in this area. You have encounter data, you have appointment data, you have prescription data, you have all the interaction data, right? That's a really important one, right? Because what I think a lot of providers struggle with today is, well, I've got 4, 5, 6 different tools to communicate with patients. How do I solve for that? And what we're finding is there's not a singular approach to that. What we're actually recommending in many instances is actually a hybrid approach, right? There's going to be the EHR, and likely there's going to be communications and interactions that needs to manage from a clinical experience standpoint, right? If it knows about the appointments, maybe it should be the tool that sends the appointments. However, there's a lot of interactions and activities that occur before and after care that the EHR won't know about. And so how do we facilitate those interactions and give a 360-degree view of everything, regardless of whether or not the CRM is executing that communication, right? And so if we think about that, some of the use cases that we typically focus on now that that data sits out there, and now that you're running data on the cloud, you have Salesforce sitting on the cloud, there's a few things that we see. One is patient acquisition and activation, right? And so how do we find patients and how do we drive them through the most engaging experience they can have? But how do we use information about them to curate that, right? And make it very bespoke, right? The second area is around patient access, right? And think about patient access broader than just the phone call, right? We're talking about patient access from a chat perspective. We're thinking about patient access from an autonomous agent, which, believe it or not, that's happening in healthcare already. I have a customer right now that is looking to deploy autonomous agents to solve for the prescription refill process, right? As you can imagine, most organizations, 20 to 25% of their phone calls are around prescription refill. People calling to say either, I need to refill my prescription, or has it been refilled? That's not a really good use of time for a human agent to do. And how do we deflect those type of calls? And so what we're creating is the ability, because the cloud infrastructure has been set up, because the APIs exist and we've already unlocked that data, we have the ability to allow that patient to go to a chatbot on the web, say I'd like to refill my prescription. It automatically authenticates and pulls back their current prescriptions out of the EHR. Which one would you like to refill? You click the one you like to refill, it automatically sends a message back to Epic Inbox, and that entire workflow runs the way it would typically run. So not only did we solve for deflection, but we also solve for it to being a really nice, natural language experience for that individual. That same agent that we're creating, we're also creating it to find clinic hours, as an example. Typically, you got to go to the provider search capability, find the location you want to find, look at the hours, look at the type of doctor. Wouldn't it be nicer to just say, I need an orthopedist who has availability at 4 o'clock on the 24th. And it brings back which clinic, which doctor has availability, and oh, by the way, let's also just allow them to book that appointment, right? And so that all wraps into sort of this patient access side, but also where we see it is when a patient calls in, now we have a lot of data at our disposal, and that data doesn't have to sit on Salesforce, right? With zero copy capabilities, you can have that data sitting on AWS or any other cloud vendor and pull that data in real time and allow you to see those insights. So example might be if a patient calls in and you want to know about all their encounter information, we can show that. But what about if they have an outstanding bill? Wouldn't it be helpful to know that if they're booking a new appointment, we notify them that they have an outstanding bill from a rev cycle standpoint, right? Wouldn't it be helpful to know that that individual fits within the segment that's at a higher risk for needing a colonoscopy and they haven't had one in a year. So I'm going to prompt that agent to proactively talk to that individual and say, hey, by the way, you haven't had a colonoscopy in the last year, right? Again, the ability to have those engaging and proactive conversations with the patient is fundamentally based on, can you access that data, can you utilize that data and use it at the right point in time to really drive those outcomes that you're focused on. The third bucket that we're really seeing is also, how do we take all this data and actually drive more growth? As we all know, sort of since COVID, right, providers are still struggling with growth, right, and revenue constraints, not to mention they already have minuscule margins. And so how can we take this information now and get some insights around that to drive and reduce what we typically focus on are things like leakage, right? So leakage might be patients that try to get an appointment but can't get an appointment because it's a bad experience, there's not availability. Leakage can also be, we match the patient with the wrong provider. So how do we solve for that? Data, right? If we know what that patient preferences are of that individual, we know what their historical information is from the EHR, we can curate a match for them and say, hey, while I typically might send that individual to Dr. Jones, who's a male, that has availability 6 weeks and doesn't speak Spanish, the likelihood of that individual showing up for that appointment is much lower because that's not the type of doctor that they want. However, if we use those patient preferences, we know that they actually want to see a female that speaks Spanish, and oh, by the way, they don't want to travel more than 5 miles, and that doctor has availability within the next 2 weeks, right? The data allows you to unlock that better experience, that better match, and ultimately the goal is to reduce that leakage, ensure that that individual shows up, right? At the end of the day, outcomes are driven by patients actually taking care of their health. It doesn't do anything if they book a bunch of appointments and never show up. And so our goal is to take that data, allow us to do things like acquiring those patients, engaging with those patients more effectively when they actually call in, and also ensuring that we are giving them the best possible care throughout that entire life cycle. And so if you buy into that model, what we're trying to do is help these organizations expose that data in these variety of different ways. And yesterday, there was a panel, and one of the things that was really compelling that was said, and Ford referenced as well, is yes, data is the new currency. The other important thing is, can you trust that data? And so there's a lot of scenarios where on top of the raw data, it's being enriched, right? But that might be enriched in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 disparate systems within the organization. And so part of the effort that we typically go through is not just how do we expose that data, but how do we make sure that data is trustworthy? And we believe that data is actually going to be leveraged and is a singular source of truth across the enterprise for all these different use cases. The final item I'll say, and we'll probably end a little bit early to make sure we have some time for questions, is outside of sort of the patient-facing side of the house, right? You think about engagement, driving sort of journeys and campaigns, and the experiential side of the house, which is the core world where Salesforce really plays and drives. We also see that the ability to expose this data on AWS and have Salesforce working with it also drives some other newer capabilities, for example, around data monetization, right? Often that's not spoken about within the healthcare space, but the reality is it occurs all the time, right? And so, for example, you're a safety net hospital. If they are a pediatric hospital, your data is actually very, very valuable, not just to other health systems. It's very, very valuable to pharmaceutical companies. It's very, very valuable to medical device companies. And so a lot of what we focus on often is, first, let's get it right for the end user, the consumer, the patient, even the providers themselves. The second stage of this is, now that we've got this data sitting in a place that's accessible, can we monetize that data in different ways? Can we find ways to drive growth and enhance the overall care by working with healthcare and life sciences partners to say, hey, we understand what the right profile of a patient is that typically reacts well to this surgery or to this drug, and so let's expose that, let's use that, and let's refine those drugs, let's refine those processes and the protocols so the next time around, we're going to be that much better as an industry, as an organization, as opposed to locking that data within and saying, hey, we know what we think are good protocols, we're not going to expose those to anyone else, and ultimately the entire system doesn't get better. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing. We've got about 5 minutes left, so welcome any questions if anyone has any. If not, we certainly can stay around for a little bit and answer questions here on the floor after.